Welcome to Asian American Life. I'm your host, Ernabel DeMillo. It's National Book Month, and we have a special featuring a who's who in the literary world. Some of these book authors started their book tour right here at UNE Books in Chinatown. Let's take a peek. In 2021, Lucy Yu opened the first Asian American woman-owned bookstore carrying titles about the Asian American diaspora and immigrant experience. Located in Manhattan's Chinatown, UNE Books has a vibrant hub for author events, drawing in celebrities like Randall Park. The store's name, you could say, is a pun suggesting a community that connects people through stories and tea. Not only are the brightest stars featured in staff picks and book talks, but you could also find hidden gems of self-published authors and independent publishers. Up next on Asian American Life, Author Radha Vatsal discusses mystery thriller number 10 Doyer Street. Sally Kim breaks the publishing glass ceiling. Giving voice to the belonging, Michael Luo's bestseller Strangers in the Land. Third State Books, a home for diverse authors. All the president's menus and the Asian heritage chefs who created them. This and more on Asian American Life.
I'm Vivian Lee. A new work of historical fiction, Number 10 Doyer Street, is set during the fight to save Manhattan's Chinatown in the early 1900s. Its main character is the narrator, a South Asian woman who's also covering the real-life trial of gang leader Mock Duck, who's fighting for custody of his child.
Mock Duck had this reputation. He was 27 at the time. He was this ruthless gangster, but what a lot of people didn't know is that he had this little adopted daughter who was 6 years old, who he really loved, and she lived with him on 10 Doyer Street.
The street that gives Radha Vatsal's mystery novel its title was teeming with life in the turn of the 20th century, as depicted in this postcard from 1898. It was also the most murderous street in the country for decades because of gangsters. Police and the press at the time dubbed Doyer Street the Bloody Angle.
Bloody Angle because it had this very sharp angle, but also because there were shootouts. So many shootouts took place.
Number 10 Doyer Street opens, in fact, with a gangland shooting that actually happened at the Chinese Opera House across the street from Mock Duck's apartment. Members of Mock Duck's gang, the Hip Sing Tong, targeted rivals in the On Leong Tong during a live performance.
The theater was supposed to be neutral territory, no violence was supposed to happen here, and this sort of caused a consternation within the community and outside.
From there, the story of the Opera House slayings intersects with a famous child custody case. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, also known as the Jerry Society, forcibly removed Mock Duck's daughter from their home. A sensational New York Times article from 1907 reported that a, quote, white girl, 6 years old, was practically a prisoner, end quote.
Cruelty sought at Mock Duck's. But the way the story was written, it was quite lengthy. It was horribly racist, but then also Mock Duck had this wife and this child, and he had an Irish maid in the story. And so I thought, what is going on? And the idea that this young gangster in his 20s, who at that time I had not heard of, cared so much about his young daughter. And then I just felt like I had to look into that story and see what was going on.
Mock Duck and his real-life arch-rival, Tom Lee of the On Leong Tong, provide Number 10 Doyer Street its spirit. Mock Duck, born Cy Wing Mock, even has his own entry in the Museum of the City of New York's archives. Other historical events and people provide the texture of the rapidly modernizing city in 1907. The ambitious New York City Mayor George B. McClellan, Jr., his campaign to build the Catskill Aqueduct that he championed, George Washington Plunkett, a politician who openly cheered political graft, and the murder trial of multimillionaire Harry Thaw, accused of killing in cold blood the architect of the Washington Square Arch.
Thaw shoots Stanford White on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden. So that's kind of like the O.J. Simpson trial of the day. And it turns out that Mock and Harry Thaw have used the same lawyer, this man called Daniel O'Reilly. And then I start seeing these stories that the city at the same time is trying to raise Chinatown and replace it with the park. So there was a lot going on, and I felt, you know, you could have done the story that's just like a domestic drama with Mock Duck and his daughter and their court case, but I felt his story and his relationship to Chinatown was also part of a larger story about Chinatown and its relationship to New York City.
The novel also mentions Dr. Anandabai Joshi, the first South Asian woman to become a doctor in the U.S., and Pandita Ramabai, a social reformer who wrote a book about American life. Vatsal says she discovered their histories in 19th century USA after she chose to model the narrator after herself, a woman journalist and Indian immigrant.
I came here when I was quite young, when I was 16, and so I bring my immigrant perspective as a fellow Asian, but a South Asian, not an East Asian, to the story, and I wanted the narrator to reflect that. But then, in my mind, I was like, oh, but that's impossible. There were no people from South Asia in New York at the time. I discovered, in fact, there had been people from India who came to the US in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Our own prejudices keep us from seeing that the past was actually, in many ways, much more modern, much more open-minded than we kind of give it credit for.
Number 10 Doyer Street surfaces new perspectives about a beloved, ever-changing neighborhood still fighting to survive in its dynamic city. For Asian American Life, I'm Vivian Lee.
The publishing industry generated close to $23 billion of revenue in 2023. But like most traditional media, publishing is facing serious hurdles. Little Brown & Company, one of the oldest publishers in the U.S., has a new captain at its helm to navigate publishing in the digital age. Her name is Sally Kim, and she's the first Asian American to hold that position.
What book had the most impact in your life?
Pinpoint one right now would be Bone by Fei Min Ying.
Sally Kim is the president and publisher of one of the oldest and storied publishing houses in the U.S., Little Brown & Company, founded in 1837, known for publishing the works of Louisa May Alcott and J.D. Salinger.
I think what's so interesting is that for us, these catalogs are such a record of, you know, what were the interests and what were the conversations in 1868.
A recipient of the Poets and Writers Editors Award, Kim is a unicorn in the publishing industry. The 30-year veteran has worked at each of the big 5 publishing houses in the U.S., and she's recognized as the first Asian American to hold one of the highest positions in publishing today.
I've frankly worked hard to get a seat at the table, and now I realize that my role is to really help not just other writers, you know, find their way to the forefront, but to help other people in publishing and create space around that table so that the books that are being published now are not a reflection of an anointed few, but it's really a reflection of the readers who are out there.
Kim's story began just a block from the local library in Torrance, a suburb of Los Angeles. The daughter of Korean immigrants was a voracious reader.
I would walk down the street, go get a pile of books, take them back home, read them, go back, and I would have a new pile of books. And no one ever limited what I could do or read.
But her journey into publishing took some tenacity. At the time, there were few Asian Americans in the industry and on the bookshelves.
It would be not unusual to be a young assistant and be kind of, you know, sort of required to sit around the table, you know, and at the table were the editors who get to decide, you know, bandy back and forth about the books that we should be buying.
She spoke, of course, and her voice carried her to the glass towers of New York's publishing world, where she elevated authors like Kylie Reed, Robert Jones Jr., and Catherine Min, whose novel The Fetishist was published posthumously.
Catherine Min had sadly passed away in 2019 at an early age of 60, and her daughter had discovered that Catherine had written a almost finished novel called The Fetishes sitting on her laptop. To be then, flash forward to be in a position as a publisher to buy a book, that unfinished novel, and to bring it to publication was, to me, just a real kind of moment, because I realized in many ways how far we've come as an industry, how far, I think my own personal journey has been, where I was in a position to say, this is a book that needs to be published.
But books and publishing are facing many hurdles. Book bans in schools are on the rise. And in the digital age, fewer Americans are reading books.
We have to be much more nimble and listen and be smarter about, what are people engaging with and how do we find readers where they are? That's made us much more open to where we're getting our information and how we're listening to our audiences. And that includes having a more diverse group of people sitting at that table.
Kim says it's too early to tell what a Little Brown & Company catalog will look like under her leadership. But 30 years into the industry, she still wonders if the next manuscript she picks up could be the best book she's ever read.
Publishing books, it's like having a little pieces of your heart out there in the world.
For Asian American Life, I'm Rainer Ramirez.
The history of the Chinese in America is a heartbreaking and violent story of exclusion, but it's also an inspiring example of resistance and resilience. A compelling story that's captured in the new novel Strangers in the Land by executive editor at The New Yorker and author Michael Luo. Michael, thank you for joining me to talk about your book, Strangers in the Land. I have to say, I was so pleasantly surprised when I started reading the book because I saw that it was a history book with 500 pages. And then when I started reading it, I became engrossed in the personal stories that you put into it and that kind of seamlessly wove it into this great history of the Chinese in America. I know that you have a personal story that inspired this book. Can you tell me about it?
Well, first of all, thank you for that compliment about the book, because that is what I was trying to do. In terms of the personal story about what inspired the book, I think there are kind of two inciting incidents. The most immediate is the pandemic and the surge in violence against Asian Americans. And I wrote a piece for The New Yorker that drew on some of this history. And that piece most immediately kind of led to the book proposal and the discussion with publishers. The kind of earlier inciting incident is kind of a more personal thing. That took place in the fall of 2016. This was just before Trump was elected. You could feel in the air this kind of creeping sense of nativism. My family, I have two kids, and a woman just brushed past us, aggravated that we were blocking the sidewalk, and she turned to us and said, go back to China. And I was like, are you serious? Like, did you really just say that? This is the year 2016, though, and you're saying this to me. We kind of went back and forth, and she yelled down the street, go back to your effing country. And I, in my attempt to kind of come up with some sort of, smart retort, I was like very pathetically yelled, I was born in this country. And then I wrote an open letter to her, and I told her about this kind of feeling of otherizing that is very common in the Asian American experience. And I wrote about this kind of feeling that I had inside me, this kind of sadness I felt as I was walking away, just thinking about whether my kids, who are 2 generations removed from my parents' immigrant experience, would ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. And that went viral, and the Times actually published the open letter on the front page of the print newspaper, which is an extraordinary thing.
I think most Americans don't know the history of the Chinese in America. Why do you think that is?
History is written by the powerful, and the powerless are often left out of history. So you have to work hard to tell those stories.
Tell me when, how, and why the Chinese immigrants first came to the U.S.
Yeah. So this book starts in the gold rush, and the gold rush was this unprecedented migration from around the world to California and the West Coast, and the Chinese were in that global migration. The vast majority of Chinese migration came from southeastern part of China called Guangdong Province in this kind of area called the Pearl River Delta. There are multiple reasons that the migration seems to have come from this place. There was a lot of turmoil, there was violence, there was economic circumstances, but there's also, I think, a proximity to Western trade that made this people willing, open to venturing across the ocean. There are other things that are kind of known in history as big drivers of Chinese labor, like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Let's talk about the white American reaction to it. A large part of the book, and really what struck me and I thought was so heartbreaking, were these constant stories of the violence.
The first big atrocity took place in 1871, and this was the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, where I think it was like 19 Chinese were killed and most of them lynched. It's one of the worst mass lynchings in American history. What actually, though, becomes a pattern is what happened in 1885, 1886, which historians now call the driving out. And this was nearly 200 communities in the American West that physically, violently, in many cases, expelled the Chinese from their midst.
When the Chinese Exclusion Act came along, that was the first time that a group of people had been banned from entering the U.S., correct?
Yeah, it's a giant pivot point in American history that the Chinese Exclusion Act represented, that for the very first time we were passing laws regulating immigration designed to keep certain people out based on effectively their race.
It's also a story about resistance and resilience. Tell me about that side of it.
Yeah, totally. The amazing thing is that the Chinese were not driven out. They returned to a lot of these communities. Despite all the efforts to keep them out of America, they continue to find ways to come.
When I was reading these random acts of violence, or mobs or massacres, it really brought to mind the random acts of violence against Asian Americans during the pandemic. What does that say to you about where our society is?
I mean, obviously, when I wrote that piece for The New Yorker that drew on some of this history in the middle of all of that, this kind of surge in violence against Asian Americans, and I was trying to make the point that this has been part of our history, that we've been told to go back to our country for a long, long time. Many Asian Americans are very successful, but yet there is this feeling of otherness that a lot of us feel, and this precarity, I think, is a good word to describe it, of the Asian American experience. And I think that's what a lot of people realized in the pandemic, the precarity of the Asian American experience. What would it take to overcome that? A lot of conversations like this, a lot of people reading this book, a lot of representation, I think.
Why do you think the history of the Chinese in America is important for people to know?
I mean, Asian American history is American history. That's what I want people to know and believe and realize. I think that when you know history, when you know where context, when you know the stories of a people, it builds empathy. It gives you context for understanding them.
Strangers in the Land by executive editor at The New Yorker and author Michael Luo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was great to talk to you, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Charles Kim grew up in Maine, loving to read, but he never saw characters in the books he read who looked like him. That stuck with him, and years later, he decided to do something about it to make sure that the next generation sees themselves on the pages and know their stories matter.
My mother brought my two brothers and me here to the States when I was 7, almost 8, and we settled in Maine, in a little town called Biddeford. My mother worked 2 full-time jobs as a single mother, and after school we would go to the library, and the public librarians there, the children's librarians, basically helped raise us.
That library became a sanctuary and planted the seeds in Kim for a lifelong love of books. But it wasn't until after graduate school, where he studied French literature, that his journey into publishing began.
I was offered a part-time job as an accounts manager at an agency called the French Publishers Agency. We got 1,000 of France's best books every year, and we chose about 300 to work on them. And so it was this wonderful opportunity to just read and speak French all day. And
even then, Kim recognized the absence of Asian representation among France's leading publishers, a pattern he later saw echoed in the American publishing world. Through roles at U.S. literary agencies and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian and at the Museum of Modern Art, where he began publishing children's books and deepening his commitment to inclusive storytelling.
Throughout this entire time of 31 years in publishing, it just kept coming up over and over and over that people that looked like me might be publishing books, but the industry itself was really lacking in AAPI representation, and that it affected not only the kinds of stories that are told, but also how Asian American authors reach their audiences.
That's what ultimately inspired the publishing industry veteran to launch Third State Books in January 2023 as the only general interest publisher in America that publishes exclusively Asian American writers and stories. The name Third State has a special meaning for Kim.
We can bring the best of our Asian heritage, we can bring the best of what America is, and bring them together into this new third hybrid space where it's really a narrative about the assets that we bring and not about some sort of deficit or not meeting a certain standard. So for AAPI Heritage Month, we did a cover on Publishers Weekly featuring our true crime titles.
Kim guided me through the breadth of Third State's titles, which encompass everything from investigative true crime and contemporary romance to imaginative children's literature.
And then The Veil is really one of the first works of children's literature to discuss AI in depth.
In addition to Third State Books, Charles Kim also founded the Asian American Book Club and the Asian American Book Con, initiatives designed to build community and help AAPI authors and readers to connect. I'm Kyung Yoon for Asian American Life.
Cooking to the President's Taste is more than just a cookbook filled with recipes. It's also a lesson on a little-known history of Asian chefs in the White House. You could say this book is serving. What's cooking in the White House?
We have the first course, which is this big pea soup that we will be serving with just a little American caviar on a cornet. And then the second course is Dover sole, wonderful fish from England.
This was 2008 when executive chef Christetta Comerford gave viewers a behind-the-scenes look at preparations for an important state dinner with the Queen of England. Comerford made history and headlines as the first woman and first Filipina executive chef in the White House. She was appointed by Laura Bush back in 2005. Comerford, who retired in 2024, is in fact part of a very long line of Asian chefs who have fed and expanded the palates of U.S. presidents. Chefs with roots from all over Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, including Comerford's successor, Tommy Kerpradit, who is Thai. Their stories now come to life in a new cookbook, Cooking to the President's Taste, Asian Heritage Chefs in White House History. Co-author Adrian Miller, known as the Soul Food Scholar, accidentally stumbled on this history while researching for another book he was working on, featuring African-American presidential chefs.
And so about 10 years ago, I was in my hometown, Denver, Colorado, at the University of Denver, special collections, because they have a cookbook collection with thousands of volumes. So I just put in presidential food just to see what would come up. And then the memoir cookbook of Lee Ping-kwan shows up. And it turns out he was the presidential yacht chef for Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. So I thought this needs to be shared with the broader public at some point, because he published the cookbook in 1939 and it fell into obscurity. And there's very few copies left out there, so I thought we got to get this story out.
Lee Ping-kwan's story led Miller to discover more Asian chefs in the White House, a total of 37 who worked in various positions, from the presidential yachts to leading the White House kitchen. But Miller thinks that there may be more. That's because not much is written about the kitchen staff. That is, until this cookbook.
Yeah, I just think it's a very unique window on the American presidency, one that we've never ever seen before.
For example, Kwan was already a famous chef in China when he immigrated to the U.S. He enlisted in the Navy. At the time, it was a pathway to U.S. citizenship for many Asians.
So he comes to the United States, he's in the U.S. Navy, he serves on a number of ships, torpedo boats and other things. But his cooking was so excellent that he keeps getting promoted and assigned to different. And in the Navy, they take food very seriously. Like these admirals, and all, they love some good cooking.
The cookbook features many of Chef Kwan's original recipes, Chinese dishes, and flavors.
The Coolidges seem to like Asian food. And I thought that was really neat. I mean, so things like egg rolls, scallop stir fries, things that still exist today.
And thanks to Deborah Chang, the book's co-author, you can take a bite out of history. She curated the recipes, and several of Coolidge's favorite Asian dishes are in the cookbook, including the egg roll. Choosing which recipes to include proved to be quite challenging. For instance, some ingredients are no longer available.
I wanted to be true to what his recipe was, and so it didn't become my recipe in any way.
The cookbook also features other little-known chefs. The earliest they identified was a man named Yoji-ro from Japan, who served on the USS Mayflower under President McKinley in 1900. There's also Filipino Ireneo Esperancilla, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal chef. Esperancilla started on Roosevelt's presidential yacht before it was decommissioned, and continued to work under Truman and Eisenhower. And it was Eisenhower who elevated the first Asian to lead the White House kitchen, Filipino chef Pedro Udo.
So he was the head chef during the second term of President Eisenhower, made state dinners. He was very well known as a cake maker, so I'm glad that we included this beautiful picture of him making a cake in the White House kitchen. Mamie Eisenhower loved his cakes and sent him thank you notes, that kind of thing.
It's no surprise the Filipino chefs introduced a few of their native dishes to the presidents and their families. I love also that some of my two favorite Filipino dishes are in this cookbook, adobo and pancit. And whose recipes are those?
So the adobo one is from a guy named Ariel de Guzman, who was basically cooked a lot for Vice President and then later President George Herbert Walker Bush. So he cooked for him during his vice presidency, during his presidency, and then afterwards. And then you call it pancit?
Yeah.
Okay. That recipe is from Ireneo Esperancilla's family. So that's the family recipe.
So I love that the Bushes were eating adobo.
Yeah.
For Asian American Life, I'm Ernabelle DeMillo. And that's our show for now. Be sure to stop by You and Me Books right here in Chinatown to check out their extensive collection of books written by Asian American authors. And if you want to learn more about all our stories, you could follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Asian American Life. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app so you can watch us on the go. I'm Ernabelle DeMillo. I'll see you next time. Now, go read a book.